Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I'd ask consent for an additional 10 minutes on top of the 10 minutes I've been allotted.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm sorry that my colleague from Colorado has the misfortune of being in the chair when I'm giving a speech, but it's nice to see you here. I wanted to come to the floor today to mostly say thank you, but also make some observations on a day that where I'm actually proud of the Senate. And proud of the work that we've been able to do to reauthorize the Elementary and Secondary School Act today with a vote in the Senate of 85 yes votes, coming after a vote in the House of Representatives. There was 359 yes votes. This comes after a time when just months ago it seemed that as though we were paralyzed on this bill, both in the House and in the Senate. In fact, the House passed a very partisan bill that didn't get one Democratic vote, and when the Democrats were in charge, we passed bills that didn't get Republican votes and then couldn't even get them to the floor. And now we find ourselves just a few months later with a huge bipartisan result. And I want to start by commending Lamar Alexander, the senator from Tennessee, the chairman of the Health, Education, and Labor Committee, for his extraordinary leadership, and to Patty Murray, the ranking member of the committee, for her leadership. They ran this committee, they ran this process in a way that ought to set the standard for the rest of the committees in the Senate. They followed regular order. They started with a bipartisan product. They asked every single member of the committee whether we had ideas to try to improve the legislation. They moved it out of committee unanimously. Unanimously. This is a committee that has on it the junior senator from Kentucky and the junior senator from Vermont, just to pick two examples, and they got a unanimous vote. And then we brought it to the floor. We had amendments, an open process, passed it off the floor. The House passed their version of the bill. We had an actual conference committee, Mr. President. Can you imagine that? I think it's the second one, or maybe the third. There was one fake one, and then two real ones since I've been here in the last 7 years. I've actually had the good fortune to be on two of them, including this one. And we produced a product and got it to the floors, and now it's going to the president's desk. Now, I say to the pages that are here today that we're 8 years late in the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind. The bill expired, in effect, 8 years ago, and we've taken 8 years to get this work done, which, if you're grading us in terms of getting our homework done in time, if the teachers at the Page School had the opportunity to scold you for being 8 years late with your homework, they probably would. And that's where we find ourselves. But I'm going to celebrate because I'm glad this day has finally come, because for teachers and for principals and for students and for families all across the country, that this change is going to come as a great relief. Some people ask, why should the federal government have any role in education at all? And I think it's a fair question because of what we spend on K-12 education, only 9% of it is federal. The rest of it is all state and local. And the reason why the federal government is involved is because of the civil rights impulse that says that kids ought to have a great education no matter what zip code they're born into. That's what we tell ourselves, that if you are lucky enough to be born to wealthy parents or unlucky enough to be born to poor parents, when it comes to your education, you ought to be able to get a quality education. The federal government is meant to help ameliorate the differences that exist in too many places all across the country. And that was the idea when we got involved in this in the 1960s. And then you fast forward to No Child Left Behind. The idea that George Bush had and Ted Kennedy had and the others that worked on that bill, Margaret Spellings and others had, was that our kids are not succeeding all across the country, and they're not remotely having the same opportunities, and we ought to expose that to the country. And notwithstanding all the things about No Child Left Behind that I can't stand, the one thing I'll be forever grateful for was the requirement that districts across the country annually assess kids and disaggregate the data so people can see how kids are doing by ethnic group and by their level of poverty or affluence, and that we expose that to the country. and stop hiding from what are terrible results for many kids living in the United States. And over the period of time that No Child Left Behind has been in place, we've been unable to hide from the results that we've seen. And what are those results, Mr. President? I mean, it's very clear now that we've studied it that if you're a kid born into poverty, you arrive at kindergarten having heard 30 million fewer words than a more affluent peer. Ask any kindergarten teacher in America whether that's going to affect the outcomes in kindergarten, and she'll tell you. We now know that there are whole communities in America, across cities and across rural areas, where there's not a single school that anybody in this body would be willing to send their kid or their grandkid. Not one. And those of us that are proponents of school choice, as I am, need to recognize that there are huge parts of geography in the United States where there is no choice. The choice is illusory. You have one lousy school to choose from and another lousy school to choose from. And then what we've discovered is that we've made it harder and harder for people to be able to afford college. As other countries around the world are understanding that more than ever, you need something north of a high school diploma to compete. So when George Bush, the son, and Mr. President, this is a temporal observation, not a partisan observation. When George Bush, the son, became president, we led the world in the production of college graduates. Today, we're something like 16th. And my question is, do we want to be 32nd? Or do we want to do something different to give people greater opportunity? And as I've said on this floor before, where this all ends is in a situation where if you're a kid born into poverty in America, your chances of getting a college degree or its equivalent are roughly 9 in 100. They're not roughly 9 in 100, they're 9 in 100. Which means if these Senate chairs and these desks, there are 100 in this chamber, were inhabited by poor kids instead of by senators, there'd be those three seats, and 3 of those seats in that row that would be inhabited by college graduates. The entire rest of this chamber would not be. And I think that if we face those odds for our own kids in this body, if the senators here face those kind of odds for our own kids, we'd quit the Senate. And we'd go home and we'd try to fix whatever we could fix to ensure that our children didn't have a 9 in 100 chance, but maybe had a 90 in 100 chance of being able to make a decision about whether they wanted to go to college. And I think one of the reasons why we find ourselves with those kind of results for our kids, not just around education, but around healthcare and around many other issues, is that too often we're treating America's children like they're someone else's children, not like they're our own children. And if we treated them like we were our own children, I think that they were our own children, I think it would focus our mind. I think that not just on education, but on all kinds of issues, we'd stop figuring out how to get through the week, stop trying to figure out how to keep the lights on for one more week or one more month, or do a temporary tax deal that we could, call a year-long deal, and it's actually a 2-week tax deal at the end of the year. And we'd actually start doing what the American people want us to do, which is invest for the next generation. Invest for the next generation in terms of infrastructure, in terms of immigration policies, in terms of energy, approaching the next generation by saying, you know what, we have a theory about how we're going to right the fiscal problems that this country faces, and we'd be doing a lot, state, local, and federal government, to ensure that we had an education system that was much more aligned to the outcomes we want for kids than the system that we have. But having said all of that, I'm so glad that we've made the decision that we have made to pass this bill today, because if you had a rally tomorrow to keep No Child Left Behind the same out on the steps of the Capitol, literally no one would show up, which maybe explains why we've been able to get this bipartisan result in the end. I think the other thing that explains it is the fact that No Child Left Behind itself, when it was passed, represented perhaps the biggest and greatest federal incursion on state and local governments that we've seen in modern American history. And part of what we're doing here by changing the way this bill works is retreating, which I think is appropriate and what we should do. When I was superintendent of the Denver Public Schools, I used to wonder all the time why people in Washington were so mean to our kids and to our teachers. And what I realized being here is that they're not mean, it's just that they have absolutely no idea what's going on in our schools and our classrooms. I think it's perfectly reasonable for the federal government to say, we expect you to do better. We expect you to close these achievement gaps. We have a national interest in knowing that kids are moving forward no matter where they're born. Just as I think we have a national interest in understanding where the next 1.5 million teachers are going to come to replace the teachers that we have lost. But when I was the superintendent, the last thing I wanted was anybody in Washington telling me how to do the work, or telling my teachers and principals how to do the work. That's not the province of anybody in Washington, D.C., and there was too much of that with No Child Left Behind. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a few aspects of the bill today that I think are important. I'm not going to touch on everything because there was an awful lot that changed. The first thing of importance to me was thinking about what we could do to make a contribution to thinking about how we spend money when it comes to schools and understanding better how those resources are used. I mentioned earlier that the whole reason the federal government is involved in education is because of a civil rights impulse. But it might surprise you to know, Mr. President, that we are only one of 3 countries in the OECD who spend more money on affluent kids than we do on kids in poverty as a country. And part of that has to do with the way we fund education through property taxes, but part of it is compounded by the way the federal government has required reporting from school districts and states going back to the 1960s, where we said to states and school districts, you need to report not in actual teacher salaries, but in average teacher salaries. That's what we're going to require you to do. And for reasons that I'm not going to belabor here today, that became something called the comparability loophole and meant that it was unclear where the resources were going, including the Title I resources, which are meant for kids living in poverty. I wanted to close the comparability loophole as part of this legislation. We got a vote in the committee, but it didn't make it into the bill. But we have made a big change in reporting. Which is that we are now requiring districts and states to report on actual teacher salaries, not average teacher salaries. And what that's going to mean is much more transparency about where money is flowing in our school districts. And it's pretty easy to think about it this way. If you imagine average salary for a school district, if you're in a high poverty school, tends to be, it's not always true, tends to be that younger teachers, newer teachers are in that school. Those newer teachers are paid not at the average salary, they're paid at an actual salary down here. Whereas you go to a more affluent school and teachers tend to be more experienced, tend to be paid more, and they're paid up here. So in the wealthier school, the school is billed as though it's paying average salaries here, even though it's paying up here. In the poor school, they're being billed as though they're being paid here, but they're being paid down here. That's a travesty. That's a massive subsidy that's running from poor kids to wealthier kids in this country because of the requirements of the federal government. Going back to the 1960s, we at least have changed that reporting, and I believe in the next incarnation of this legislation, we will finally change the budgeting itself. We focused also on teacher leadership as part of this bill, and teachers in general. They're the most important thing when it comes to a quality education. We know that the most important thing a kid can get who's living in poverty is 3 years of tremendous instruction. If they do, we can close the achievement gap. We know that we can. And there's a lot of attention paid to this question of how do we get rid of low-performing teachers, and having been a superintendent, I'm all for it. But the most important question, or the thing that we need to observe, is that we're losing 50% of our teachers from the profession in the first 5 years. What is it we can do to keep teachers longer than that? We can't keep them for 30 years anymore. It's not going to happen. We imagine that that's what's going to happen. We have exactly the same system that was designed when we had a labor market that discriminated against women and said, you have two choices. One's being a teacher and one's being a nurse. So come teach Julius Caesar every year for 30 years of your life in the Denver Public Schools. Those days are over. They're over. And our compensation system and the way we train people and the way we inspire people to teach needs to change to match the labor market that we have today. And we couldn't obviously solve that problem in this bill. That problem's not going to be solved here. But we did create more flexibility. We rewrote Title II, which has essentially been a slush fund of lousy professional development. And we focused our funding for opportunities for teachers to serve as mentors and academic coaches. Eagle, Durango, and Adams 12 in our state are leading the way in these innovative practices. We create support for teacher residency programs inspired by the Denver and Adams State teacher residency programs, so that we're not saying we're going to have to rely on higher education programs that are not going to prepare our teachers to do the work we need them to do. Instead, we're going to train them in classrooms with master teachers so they can perfect the craft of teaching. They can bring their content matter expertise, and they can learn how to teach in the place that matters, which is in school. We have resources to train great principals, because there's nothing more frustrating to teachers than have somebody in their building that doesn't know how to lead. We've got funding to help modernize the teacher profession, from preparation, recruitment, and hiring to placement, retention, compensation, and professional development. I am often asked, what is the one thing? What is the one thing that'll change outcomes in our schools? And what I tell people is there's not one thing, it's everything. There's almost nothing about the incentives and disincentives in our K-12 system that are aligned to the outcomes that we want for kids, almost nothing. So what we say is, on all these different dimensions, school districts, feel free to innovate and feel free to use some federal resources on the most important thing you can do, which is making sure you've got a great workforce in your buildings. We've got fundings to create differentiated compensation systems and increase school leader autonomy, to support to reshape instructional time, planning time, and professional development. We're not going to hire our teachers in Washington. We shouldn't hire our teachers in Washington. But as I mentioned earlier, we do have a vital national interest in knowing that we've got a pipeline of the very best people that are coming to teach our kids. I do not mean this when I say this to sound political or to sound like a politician. It'll sound a little bit like that, but believe me, there is nobody in this room that has a job that's harder than being a teacher. And there's nobody in this building that's got a job that's harder than being a teacher in a high-poverty school. Nobody. It's the hardest job you can have. And we train people in ways that don't prepare them for the work. And we give them leadership in the building that doesn't support them in the work that they're trying to do. And we pay them a crummy wage that no one else in their college class would subject themselves to. No wonder that fewer than a third of eligible voters under the age of 30 would recommend teaching as a job to a friend. Until we change that, until we have a system that says, you know what, teaching's a great and noble profession, then it's something we can do, it's a way to give back to the community, it's a way to build the future of this country. And 70% of American voters are saying, I'd recommend that to a friend. We know we're not on the right track. And this bill doesn't solve the problem, but it points the way to flexibility that I think is vitally important. Flexibility around teachers, and also innovation to try new things, funding for schools and districts to innovate. St. Vrain has instituted a STEM academy that ought to be replicated all over. The Northwest BOCES is modernizing professional development and support for rural educators. We had some very important parts of this bill related to rural schools. And Denver Public Schools has developed a unique English learners program. These are the kinds of things that can be replicated with the innovation dollars that are in the bill. And very importantly to me, the bill supports the replication and expansion of high-quality charter schools, which we have seen have great success in Denver. I mentioned support for rural schools and districts. We have support for rural districts that I heard from who said, Michael, that's all well and good that Denver's able to get all that grant money, but we don't even have a grant writer to be able to do it. This will give them assistance to be able to write those grants, and it's going to allow rural communities for the first time, like in the communities the presiding officers from, to be able to come together as they want to do and apply jointly for funds from the federal government. On accountability, very importantly, we kept the requirement for annual testing in this bill. I hate testing as much as anybody else. The Bennet girls, who are all school students in the Denver public schools, believe me, hate testing more than anybody else. But it's critically important until we can figure out another measure. The only way we can measure growth of kids is through that annual test. And I commend Chairman Alexander for keeping that option alive in his opening bill, and we've kept it in the end. It still requires that we break down data so we can see how kids of color are doing compared to Anglo peers and how low-income kids are doing compared to wealthier kids. It requires that states address the bottom 5% of schools, and it requires states to deal with the stubborn cases of high-performing schools where there are kids in subgroups, kids of color in particular, and special needs kids that aren't succeeding and aren't performing. It also relents in an important respect and says the decisions about how to change schools don't belong with the federal government. They don't belong with the Department of Education. They belong at home. And I agree with that completely. So I want to close. I say through the chair to my colleague from New Mexico, forgive me, I asked for a few more additional moments here. But I want to thank all the Coloradans who helped us write this bill. I want to thank the Colorado Association of School Executives, the Colorado Association of School Boards, the Colorado Department of Education, the Colorado Board of Cooperative Educational Services, the Colorado Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers, Colorado, and the dozens of teachers who took time to speak with us, numerous school districts and superintendents who provided us feedback and ideas, civil rights groups across the state, including the NAACP, the Urban League, and Padres and Jóvenes Unidos, Colorado Impact Aid Advocates, the Colorado Children's Campaign, Colorado Succeeds, the Charter School League, Rural Schools Alliance, Colorado PTA, Clayton Early Learning, the Mirage Foundation, the Colorado Education Initiative, and many more. This is a great day in the Senate, Mr. President. It's proof that we can overcome our differences and come together and actually solve problems. But it's only the start of what we have to do if the next generation of Americans is going to have the opportunity that we had. And in this global economy, this shrinking economy, in some ways this savage economy, it's going to be harder and harder to get by without an education. It's going to be harder to get by with something north of a high school diploma, harder to get by with something that's less than a college education, hard to get by if you don't have access to mid-career education so you can change your profession. But we've taken a step forward in this bill. And I look forward to the day when I can come to the floor based on the results that we see that demonstrate that the zip code you're born into doesn't determine the education you get. When we're actually funding what we say we're funding in order to close the achievement gap. When we see that kids 0 to 5 actually have access to those 30 million words that the more affluent peers have. When we can say that every kid in America is going to a school that any senator in this place would be proud to send their kid. When we can say to anybody in America who's worked hard through their K-12 education and been admitted to the best college they got into, that you can go there and not bankrupt yourself or your family. Then we'll be able to come to the floor and say, you know what? We're not treating America's children like they're someone else's children. We're treating America's children like they're America's children. And I think we can get there working together. So I close by saying again, thank you to my colleagues on the Help Committee. Thank you to Senator Alexander and Senator Murray, to their counterparts on the House of Representatives. Thank you for all of your good work. With that, Mr. President, I will yield the floor.